Zeynep is a friend of mine who is a professor at the University of Alaska Anchorage. Please send her some love. Those of you that know about what's going on with the university know that it is super stressful for professors right now, not just because of basically switching an entire curriculum to be online with about a week's notice, but also due to funding cuts and issues going on with the university. So please send an outpouring of love to Zeynep. Zeynep, also on a side note, is an amazing tango dancer. So whenever we're out able to live our lives again, please shamelessly ask her to dance a tanda. She's fantastic.
Thank you.
And professionally is a food sociologist, and has created an award-winning video about food in Istanbul. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah, and it's pretty amazing, and it looks at food and culture. So I really wanted to introduce this concept. We talked about, testing blood levels. We talked about the microbiome. We talked about food from our different regions in terms of their nutritional value. But once again, I really want to emphasize the importance of recognizing and valuing the cultures of folks who are coming into our offices. There's nothing so, I think, so demeaning as having your culture be reduced when you are seeking support and healing. And so Zeynep was super helpful and accommodating and being willing to be here and chat with us today. So thank you so much for being willing to work this into your schedule with everything else going on right now. So please take your time and share whatever you would like with us. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Annette. It's my pleasure to be here. May I ask quickly, is it showing 2 slides side by side rather than the whole slide and the entire page? I'm sharing my screen. I just want to make sure that you're seeing one slide.
Yeah, I'm seeing one slide on the left, and then I'm seeing one slide on the right.
So I don't know why that is the case, and I don't know how to get rid of it, because I'm guessing that it's going to make things visibly similar and small for everyone. So do you have a trick for that?
Okay, friends online, do you guys have a trick for that?
Is that better?
There it is. That fixed it. Yep,
All
it's
right,
now one slide per screen.
Kids don't do this at home. Just clicked on various things. Probably not the right way to go.
Right. I use percussive management, and it just. Okay, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Great. Well, thank you. Hi again. My name is Zeynep Kiliç, and I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Alaska Anchorage. And when Annette asked me to do this presentation, I was quite resistant. Not simply because I didn't know that I was going to follow up Gary, which is, impossible to do, but also because I really am not in healthcare. I do not study health. I'm not a medical sociologist. So I kept resisting that this is perhaps not, that I'm not the best speaker for this event. So I just want to clarify upfront first that this is really not about how to treat TBI with food, or how we can use food as medicine. And obviously you've heard from Gary, so you don't really need me to say too much more about it. But rather, when she asked me, I was thinking, okay, how can I really make these connections between the things that I'm studying, and she herself, as somebody who experienced this trauma, clearly sees connections. So why do I see them perhaps as separate rather than deeply connected? So I basically tried to do some brainstorming, and I would like to present to you some ideas around perhaps things we can consider as we think about this kind of trauma. Does food has a place in it? What about food beliefs and practices? Can we use those things as a tool in the process of healing? And if we have to think about how individuals as part of group members, whether that's a cultural group, ethnic group, racial group, national group, or just simply as individuals, how do they actually act within the healthcare system? And are there any clues there that we can perhaps borrow from, sociologists, anthropologists, to really understand how those things might be interfering in the healthcare provided? Okay. So with those disclaimers, I guess, I want to tell you just a little bit about the kind of things that I will go over in this presentation. So I want to make sure that we're all on this same page. So I want to make sure that when I use these terminologies around self or health or social construction, that we all agree to perhaps the same definition. So I want to briefly tell you how sociologists look at issues around self, and then briefly tell you about how we study health, briefly tell you about what we mean by culture and how that might actually relate to what we're talking about today. And then finally come to food and food as a social topic and how that could actually be somewhat useful perhaps in discussing these kinds of traumas. And then how can we bring all these things together at the end? So bear with me as I go through these things. So in general, sociologists are really interested in looking at the sense of self as a socially constructed phenomena. You know, what this means is that maybe it's a little bit different than what a psychologist might be interested in when they study self, or when we talk about things like character or identity, how we present and define ourselves to the outside world. So unlike psychologists, we're much less interested in the unconscious mind, you know, so we don't really look internally to understand these concepts. We're not really, it's not that we don't think it matters, but we focus much more on what happens outside of the individual to really understand how that individual makes sense of their surrounding. So anything that is societal, anything that is outside of our perhaps control, but somehow affects how we move about in the world. And of course, everything that happens in interaction. We interact with other people, and in doing so, we create meaning, and we basically create our values and ideas, and we assign those things to various, whether objects or people or ideologies in general. So in that sense, that's the first thing I would love you to think about. If self is socially constructed, how could that be interfering in the healthcare context? And then the next thing, of course, is to look at health as socially constructed. So this may sound a little bit jarring at first, because you may think that, you know, disease is disease, and, you know, viruses and bacteria, they're just actual things. So what do you mean by socially constructed? We are much more interested in looking at how perhaps the way we understand health, health-seeking behaviors, illness as a social construct. We know that, for example, when we study historically what it meant to be sick or healthy has changed over time, and it also shifts from one place to another. And my apologies, my cat is losing its mind, scratching at the door, so I'm trying to ignore it. So one particular sociologist, Talcott Parsons, has this theory called the sick role. And basically it suggests that a sick person has to enact a performance around their illness. And they have certain social responsibilities. They have to try to get well, they have to seek help, they have to follow whatever, you know, healthcare providers tell them in terms of recommendations, and that there are some social limits. Yes, we are flexible around people who are considered sick, but it's not an indefinite time. So perhaps in society, we can relate to things like flu, you know, when you have it maybe for like a week and then people get better and then they come back to work, and that's more acceptable. But when we have chronic conditions, or when we have things that are not quite visible, perhaps, you know, from the outside, you cannot really identify people as having a health situation happening, then what happens to those perceptions obviously are quite problematic. And then, of course, this is culturally contextual as well. So I grew up in Turkey, and I've been an immigrant in the United States for 27 years, so I'm quite well adjusted by now. But I remember when I first moved here that I thought how to be a sick person was very different than the way I knew how to be a sick person. So in Turkey, when you're sick, you basically get this sort of like free card of like, you can whine as much as you can. And people just sort of like wait hand on foot for you, right? So you can really act like, oh, I'm so bad. Oh, you know, you can actually, my father would make moaning voices literally while we watch TV to make us feel all guilty because he was sick, right? And it absolves you from all kinds of social responsibilities, work responsibilities, physical responsibilities. And here, particularly in the Alaskan context, let me tell you, people were telling me, oh, you know what you should do? You should get out and ski, like get a good, get that fever out, sweat. And I was like, what? What do you mean? Like, I get to not have to do any physical activity because I'm sick. So now you're telling me I should do it because it's good for my health. And it was extremely jarring. I also noticed that, my sister-in-law, who is American, a very kind of Protestant work ethic idea, like she would get kind of upset if I just went on and on about, oh my God, you poor thing, what can I do for you? Can I make you soup? And she was just like, I'm fine, Zeynep, like this back off tone in the background. And so what I've noticed very quickly in America, bodily competence is very important. Being studious, being back to work in time, very important. And being self-sufficient and not needing. And so these kinds of things in the context of, what a sick person does in terms of their role, it was very apparent to me that culturally, the way I experienced it in Turkey was very different than the way I was going to experience it in the US, right? So I couldn't be really a nuisance and moan through my sickness in the US. So I understood that very quickly, that I had to be much more competent. And then, of course, if we were to look at health and healthcare in general within the societal context, that is also something that we see as the product of its time. We know, for example, that the way we understood or defined or diagnosed or treated things like alcoholism or ADHD, I mean, these things have changed across time. And we even see some quite moralistic, even religious, undertones in the way we approach some of these things, such as alcoholism. So we know that even the way we construct what these diseases mean change across time, and that there's a social, cultural, historical, political context to it. And of course, within the system, we have patients and providers who are human, who then have all these things that come from their own, relationship with self and society, and they're in interaction with each other, and they have to sort of make sense and create meaning together. And of course, in the healthcare industry, particularly in the West in general, we see, medicine identifies things as much more rational and scientific, empirically based, right? So we kind of treated, there is no, even the discourses around alternative medicine, holistic medicine are relatively newer concepts. So it's a particular kind of medicine that usually gets put forward. And what that means is that individuals are usually not really that rational. So if we want what the provider is giving as a prescription, and then we'd want the individuals to adhere to it, what happens during that interaction becomes very important, because they can actually completely disregard that information, because we know human beings are not rational. I mean, if nothing else, our current, toilet paper buying behavior would show us that we don't necessarily think rationally, especially when we are in fearful or unsettling and situations that we're not feeling in control of. All right, so next up, I want to tell you a little bit about how sociologists conceptualize culture, and then hopefully we can bring these things together. So culture is something that we see as shared. This is the most important aspect of culture. And of course, it's learned. In other words, we're not born with these understandings around cultural values, but that throughout our socialization, we learn to internalize our beliefs, values, and certain set of social practices that are accepted as normative and kind of expected that everyone would follow them. So because it's shared, this is an important aspect. It can kind of create this assumption that everybody as a result will share that. And of course, it's a wonderful thing that it is a shared practice, because in terms of establishing group identity, it's really a wonderful thing. It provides us with a strong sense of order, meaning, stability, right? So those are all good things. We really want to all really believe in something that is shared, but the more shared and more widely accepted it is, less scrutinized it becomes. We just sort of start assuming that everybody else really subscribe to these same kinds of practices and ideas and belief systems. So it becomes pervasive, it becomes powerful, it's unseen, but it's quite forceful. It's always sort of underneath the surface that, shapes our lives in a way. And, when those things match with other people, that's wonderful. But if you come from a particularly oppositional or different kinds of cultural system, then it can be a point of contention very easily. Even a very, like an innocent example, something like when I first moved here, I noticed that people shower every day and they basically wear everything one time and wash it immediately. So this was kind of puzzling to me, because in Turkey, even though cleanliness, being clean was important, but as a practice, families usually in the, the generation that I grew up, took a bath, did a really long, it's not a 3-minute shower, it's like almost like a half an hour ritual of cleansing, but once a week. And this obviously had economic reasons, too many people living in one house, you only have one, bath, and then heating the water all the time is expensive. The more water you use it and the more electricity you use, it exponentially becomes more expensive. In my earlier years, when I was like, I don't know, 8, 9, we had to actually have like a separate place where we had to do a coal burning stove and heat the water up that way. So, it was difficult. It wasn't really readily accessible. And therefore, we just created those kinds of practices, right? And that was a shared practice. Nobody necessarily thought that if I'm showering once a week that I'm dirty. But as soon as I got here, part of my acculturation process was that BO is like the kiss of death. Like you can't do that. So therefore, even things like, though granted, I have to say, I'm still resisting washing everything as soon as I wear it. I still sniff it. If it doesn't smell, if it doesn't have a stain, I still keep it clean and I'll wear it at least one other time. Because, also the more you wash things, worse, they basically get old quicker, you have to buy more things, so on and so forth. So you can kind of see that all kinds of things are happening. But what if we were to take this idea that something that is so good that connects us together can also be something that kind of pushes us apart? Like it can become a reason why we are not understanding each other. All right, so if I was to try to put these things together in terms of how self, culture, and health would come together from a sociological perspective, I would say that the first challenge we live in extremely diverse societies. We do not have this, perhaps the dream or the old school way of thinking about American culture equals a certain kind of people who goes to church or who eats certain kinds of foods. Now all of a sudden, America is extremely diverse, and we live in Anchorage. It has the most diverse census tract in the nation. What that means is that we have incredible ethnic, racial, linguistic, cultural diversity. So if you're in healthcare and you're a provider in this kind of a diverse environment, what do you do? Because we do know that there's going to be pretty large cultural variations across individuals' notions of health, how they perceive health, and how they see their sense of self within the health discourse. And then we know that people's understanding and perception of illness will probably be different. We know that different groups of people might have different beliefs about health risks. I mean, right now with COVID-19, we can see some of this kind of stuff, around the world, how different nations perhaps be approaching, or at least at first approach the idea of risk of people being in close contact together and what that meant. People may have different kinds of expectations around doctor-patient relationship. And of course, the level of patients' adherence to doctors' recommendations could also vary across various cultural contexts. What this means is that for healthcare providers, you really have to have this really high level of cultural flexibility. It's simply not possible to be able to know all the nuances of tens and 20, 30, 40 different groups that you may be coming into contact with. And also on top of this, we have, obviously factors such as gender and and race within that particular cultural context, age, able-bodied versus not. And all those things obviously come together, which makes it extremely difficult to navigate. But we do know that when research looks at patients' perceptions regarding quality medical encounters, they mention things like if their provider has sensitivity to alternative medicine or complementary medicine. They mention things like how the provider approaches aspects of spirituality, family. They look at things like if they respect religious adherence. If as a provider you think I have to give you a pelvic exam, that's the only way I can serve you, and that person has, some religious rule that really prevents them modesty, this, that, and the other, or perhaps it's a different gender setup, between the provider and the patient, and those things could really interfere, right? So if you want to have high quality medical encounters, it seems like in today's world, we have to really develop cultural competence. Studies also show that lack of cultural competence increases negative stereotyping of minority patients, for example. So in that sense, we know that culture influences health outcomes. And some of that could be stemming from that there is some competing frames between the ways a clinician is viewing the issue at hand and how the patient is focusing on something different. And those things obviously do matter. So, okay, finally, I make it to food. It took me only like 8-9 slides. But why do I think that food can be a tool? And I do know that we tend to talk about food as medicine, particularly in terms of thinking about traditional cultural practices. But in general, if I was to expand that idea of not just in the, let's say, Alaska Native context, but in all contexts, food can be a significant factor to deal with, I think it's valuable to consider. So I want to tell you a little bit in terms of how we understand food as a social topic in food studies. I particularly like this quotation from James Boswell from the 18th century. It says, "My definition of man is a cooking animal. The beasts have memory, judgment, and all of the faculties and passions of our minds in a certain degree, but no beast is a cook." So this really becomes a differentiating thing between the species. Basically, animals, they have their food, they find it, they hunt it, and they feed, right? But humans dine, they cook, they prepare. There's a lot that goes on between sourcing the food and actually consuming it. Everything from the way we set a table, if it's a Thanksgiving table versus a regular Wednesday night dinner. These things are not the same. If you're cooking for a love interest for the first time, well, that's different, right? If you're on a first date, what you eat, what you order, how you present yourself in terms of the kinds of foods that you eat, well, that's different versus if you're hanging out with your buddies at 11 and you're, stressed at night and you're going through pints of ice cream. So we do know that humans really assign a lot more significance to food in terms of their practices and the meanings they assign to it. And we find food really at the core of our many intimate social relationships. So the commensal aspect of it, obviously, many people are aware that we have so many sayings about bringing people around the table, right? Breaking bread. So there is definitely a strong expressive quality to food that goes beyond its objective nutritional value. So as a nutritionist, maybe you may think about, macronutrients and, if this person needs more iron, or if this person needs to lose weight, calorically, so on and so forth. But there's so much more to food beyond that, right? And all those things that are expressive and that is beyond its objective nutritional value are all in the cultural realm. This is where all the cultural beliefs and taboos and maybe religious rules and practices come into place. And this is also where we find pleasure and anxiety, right? Identity, anything from race and gender to social class, even to our nation. These are all connected concepts, and we can locate these groups of belonging through the practices of in terms of how we eat, how we cook, what we refuse to eat, so on and so forth. So in many ways, food is a tool through which we express ourselves, right? both at the individual level, but also at the group level. So in that sense, we find it super important and significant to study. The other thing that appears in the way we talk about food is that it tends to appear unimportant because it seems so mundane. Like, you drink water every day, you pee every day, and you eat every day. What is the big deal, right? It's just a biological necessity. It's repetitive, it happens all the time, it's not special. On the other hand, we also have conceptualization of food as super significant. I mean, think about, you know, food at funerals, feasting, weddings, special occasions, comfort food. So obviously food is not simply just something we consume to stay alive, that there's something more significant and heavier to it. Another way people dichotomize food or frame it in binary ways is that, you know, looking at it from the biological perspective of what food does and what you need and what it accomplishes versus cultural meanings of food. And of course, these kinds of things could include something like what's edible or inedible in one group is different to the other. What's yummy to one person is disgusting to the other, you know, like century eggs and things like that. And then, of course, what we do with food across time, you know, if you keep it traditional, is that better? If you innovate and, you know, if you make tortillas at home yourself with lard, is that better than buying a mass-produced tortilla, right? And all those things obviously connect to feeling and emotion versus really looking at it from a scientific perspective of saying something like, you have high cholesterol, you may not have XYZ, whatever those things may be. Yeah. So I want to perhaps problematize some of these binary ways of constructing food and maybe ask that we consider all of it at the same time, that it's food is actually all of these things. All right, Annette, I hope I'm doing good on time. So I just want to put it all together. As I said, I am not an expert at all who can tell you, you know, what you should or shouldn't do with food or cultural approaches regarding TBI. But I guess one thing we can think is that self before the trauma and after the trauma are likely to be different, right? And of course, the healing process is probably a process of somehow regaining former, you know, physical self, or perhaps creating and modifying a new one, right? And in fact, food preparation in and of itself can be a tool. And knowing that, of course, TBI could be, you know, the severe cases, it could be that you really cannot even think about cooking. I understand that as well. But in situations where this would be applicable, we can even think about technical aspects of food preparation, whether it's chopping, stirring, etc., and how those things could be, because they're so daily, so frequent, so mundane, we have to eat 3 times a day, and it can be ritualistic, and it can create small victories, right? And those victories matter in terms of getting back to a sense of normal, so to speak. And then there are also cognitive aspects of what's going on here, in the sense that, you know, you can follow the complex recipe to completion. And so, and of course, these things are all connected to perhaps recreating good memories, connecting to a former self through food, because we know that kitchen becomes a repository for memory, and those memories are usually embedded in smell and taste. And those embodied sensations usually take us to this, you know, concept that we call being home. And that home could be a place, a time, a flavor, a texture, right? Your mother's perfume when she was baking those cookies, whatever those things may be, they really do matter. So in fact, we can utilize some of these aspects of food, both in terms of its tactile aspect, both in terms of its embodied sensory aspect, but also it's because it's easily adaptable, and you know, it's part of our lives anyway. So it's not like asking someone to start something from scratch, take up a new hobby, you learn dancing, right, if you've never done it before. So in that sense, this can be in fact a way where we can develop and connect to this idea of self before and after this kind of trauma. The other thing I was thinking about it is in terms of the cultural framing. Now, if you're going to make any suggestions to people, you know, experiencing this kind of trauma through food, you know, what's healthy to eat for this kind of condition, obviously, I think more, cultural sensitivity to what may be a traditional food may not necessarily be seen as acceptable by nutritional standards in whatever discourse. But if somebody told me, for example, that, I can never have bread, bread is a super important aspect of Turkish culture, that would be very hard for me. Even if I can rationally understand in my mind that that's not the best thing for me, I think I would have quite a bit of resistance. Or you can think of even, my, American husband who is a male and who cannot imagine living without beef, right? So telling that guy not to eat meat. So there's like gendered aspects of how masculinity connects to, not only cooking, but consuming certain kinds of foods. So in that sense, there could be a way of creating bridges across nutrition, culture, and healing, and where food as medicine can in fact become much more maybe affordable healthcare that is more culturally sensitive. And in fact, Nancy Chan calls this matter of social justice, inclusion of different cultural contexts to really understand healing. But that this also allows us perhaps to shy away from the issue that I had at first, because I also saw this as a little distinct and separate. And I was trying to tell Annette, I'm not sure I'm the best speaker for this, but perhaps if we were to see food and medicine not as distinct, but really continuous realms that really feed off of each other, and how culture and self inform these relationships, perhaps understanding culinary values and practices as a tool to help in healing rather than seeing them as a barrier could be helpful. If to nothing else, it's perhaps to the self-perception of the person who is put in that position to respond to those recommendations. I think I may have over my time. Annette, tell me.
No, you're beautiful. You're beautiful. So thank you so much. And I'm so glad that you were willing to challenge yourself to put these things together as well. And when it comes to the idea of what you just said right before the end of your session regarding the person who's experiencing. One person said, Lisa said, notice with my TBI that I keep making the same type of food preparation and avoiding complex recipes, especially with baking. Thank you for helping me becoming aware of this. So I'm so thrilled with that comment because it's so easy to just go into this kind of what's easy, what's treating food like it's just a mundane thing, and it just takes away from some of the richness that we can have in our lives. And so then this can open up the conversations about how do we introduce complex food preparation that maybe we used to do before our injuries. How can we introduce this into our healing, into our goals with our providers? How can providers get us out of an artificial healing environment and bring us into creating healing in our own spaces, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really supremely challenging for the providers because it's such a wide variety of, I mean, first of all, you may have people who love to eat something but never cook it, right? I mean, you may have somebody who is not necessarily paying attention to the cultural aspects or not at least, consciously aware of it. So many things interfere in this. So I do really understand that providing the best care in this sense is difficult. But I think food, because it's something we have to do all the time, and it's ritualistic and it can be meditative. So it also, I think, is a possibility for us as an opportunity to say, do I really have to stick to my grandmother's recipe exactly? Or is it really in the act of making it, like adapting it the way I can do it right now, but still basically I'm honoring what we used to do with my grandmother, right? It may not be the exact same thing. But that's still beautiful, right? I mean, so it's meditative, it connects you to a sense of home, to background. It makes you feel like your competencies are, increasing, or you're using all of the capacities that are available to you. And those are great things. So how can we maybe be more open to it rather than more rigid, like don't eat gluten or lard bad, So knowing that people can have some emotional sort of responses to these kinds of generalizations that are, you know, it's not that they're wrong, but that emotionally it's hard to hear.
Mm-hmm. So just a couple more comments and then we're going to break for lunch. Speaking of food. So one person said, Zeynep, I loved your presentation. So informative and interesting. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and passion.
Thank you
Someone
so
else
much.
said, learning so much. Thank you. Your showering and clean clothes comments made me think of my neighborhood. And there's a video called Dry, a mini doc about waterless lifestyles around Fairbanks, Alaska.
Yes. Yes,
And
Alaskans are a little different in this manner, but I first moved
Mhm.
to Arizona, so I understand the distinction.
And Hannah said, we can save our societies through food, self-healing, love it. So thank you so, so much for being willing to share some of your story and your perspective. When we talk about an intercultural and a multidisciplinary perspective, it doesn't just have to be from the health perspectives. I think we can learn a lot from the groups that do work outside of just medicine. And so thank you so much for being willing to introduce some of these concepts and some food for thought, pun intended. Oh,
Well,
geez.
my
On that
pleasure.
note,
My pleasure.
uh,
And I'm sorry if this was in person, I was gonna make baklava for all of you, but
I
maybe
know.
next
Oh
time.
man, yeah. I got some baklava for takeout yesterday for today because I was craving your delicious baklava. So for the future, whenever we reschedule the in-person event, you said it. You said
Yes,
it in front of witnesses.
I
So
did say it.
come and
It's
give some
recording.
baklava. Lisa said she can give you her address. Nope, get in line. So
Yeah.
we're gonna break for lunch. We are coming back around 1 o'clock. So it's not a very long time for lunch. So enjoy yourself. Please make sure that you fulfill your soul and body with good nourishment. And thank you again, Zeynep, so much.